Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jesper Koll.
Well, welcome, and thank you very, very much for braving the Atlantic storms. You're very brave indeed, because you've come to listen to an economist, and I think I think it was the old President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, that is, who said, economists talking about economics, that's like peeing in your pants. It feels hot to you, but leaves everybody else cold. And then, you're even more brave because you coming to talk, to listen to a talk about Japan. And when about 20 years ago, I became the Japan optimist, people said, oh, Jesper, the only way you can be optimistic about Japan is when you take the charts and turn them upside down. Well, there you go. There are big issues at hand. Everywhere in the world, there's a lot of questioning about economic systems. Do they deliver what we want them to deliver? And what I want to talk about over the next 50 minutes or so is just give you a little bit of an insight into a system, an economic society system that actually does work, that does actually deliver desired results. And as you know very well, the Japanese are very shy. They take a craftsman approach. They don't want to sell, they just show you. And anybody who's ever visited Japan, I think, comes away with the feeling that, yes, there is something that is working here. So let's have a little bit of a look, but let's start at the very high level of some of the things that are going on that are sort of very disconcerting. There's obviously an enormous amount of technological change. And it's interesting, right? When you look at various sort of inventions of communication, how long did it take to reach 50 million customers? For the telephone, it actually took about 50 years before we had 50 million people connected. The internet, 7 years, ChatGPT, 38 days, and the winner is a Japanese company, right? But it's quite interesting. Obviously, this communication challenge is huge. We're very good at communicating from the few to the many. We are terrible at communicating from the many to the many. Interestingly, when you look at content, where are the high grossing franchises in terms of the content that is actually being produced? And you actually do see it's really important to know that Hello Kitty is that much better than Disney Princess. But the point I'm trying to make is very clear. When you actually look at soft power, actually the creativity of Japan and the branding, and yes, actually part of the commercialization, Japan actually does very, very well. And in fact, it's nice. Remember the late Prime Minister Abe, when the Olympic baton was passed on from Rio to Tokyo, he just popped out of a pipe and he was dying to imitate Mario, all his life. While us poor sops, we have to pay expensive top dollars to Tom Cruise, right, to pass this on to Los Angeles. So there's a hidden value, into all these things. Now, on a very, very serious note, another big concern that we actually have is that actually the systems do not deliver. I apologize. This looks at you and me. This looks at households, not at the national economy, which obviously includes corporations and the government sector. This just looks at the household sector, and you see over the last 20 years, income growth was around 28%. This is the famous elephant chart. Looks kind of like an elephant, right? What this does, it looks into the different income groups. So this is the bottom 5% of income earners globally. And this is the top 5% of income earners. And you see this chart here. Now, where it gets interesting is that when you take out China, you actually find that growth was not 28, but it was only 11. And what's more disconcerting is the reality that from the 50th percentile all the way up to the 92nd percentile, you actually find that incomes actually fell. And I think it's very important, we talk a lot about the loss of the middle class, but we just got to be very, very clear that without China, the rest of the world, the middle class actually is worse off. And that's obviously a big trigger, for why we have a lot of political uncertainty, why people are ultimately angry that the system does not deliver for them. Now, these two big things, and we can talk about this over a glass of whiskey, right? There's obviously many more. Everybody has their personal things, but these are two that are, dear to my heart here. Now, what about Japan? And I'm often accused, it's like, come on, Jesper, Japan, they haven't invented anything since the Sony Walkman. And I said, well, what car do you drive? And they said, I drive a Lexus. Well, that's actually a Japanese car, right? But where is Japan number one? Japan is number one where it needs to be. If you create an index of various sort of social problems, and be my guest, right? Life expectancy, mathematics literacy. Japan constantly scores as number 1 or 2 in the world in terms of maths aptitude for 15-year-olds. If you're a 12-year-old Japanese, you learn calculus. When Vietnam overtakes Japan as number 1, it's a national crisis. And they do stuff about it. It's quite interesting, right? Obesity. Be my guest which one it is. And you see that actually, yes, thank you, Japan is number 1 in the world in terms of the outcome that is actually created in the overall system. Now, as an aside, 8 years ago, I was invited to the Trump White House and to talk a little bit about Japan. I showed this chart and they go, yeah, go America! Yeah. Top right hand corner, right? Well, it's interesting, everybody, we love America, right? They're very focused. Now, another thing that's actually quite interesting and people actually don't remember, social mobility. If you're an economist, there's a thing called the intergenerational earnings elasticity. Basically, what that tries to measure is, do your parents have to have been rich for the next generation to end up being rich, right? And again, you see that Japan is exactly where you want to be. It's actually an incredible meritocracy. And that's, of course, because the public education system in Japan is actually excellent. It's quite interesting that you have that. And obviously, again, we've got our friends in the United States. Sorry, any Americans in the room? Oh. Okay, it's interesting that they all try to hide now. And they said, oh, but Kamala Harris. Oh, but never mind, right? But it's interesting, right? Now, actually, if the data is to be trusted, right, then obviously this is a bit of a worry. Because if you have to be the son or the daughter of a communist leader, if you have to be a princeling in order to be successful in China, that could point into something that is potentially a problem. And then, of course, you do see, and by now you will have gathered from my accent, I am from Germany. And of course, it is extremely important to note that in both of those charts, Germany is better than France. Very important, right? Keep the basics, right? We can bitch about America, we can praise Japan, but got to stay focused a little bit on things. It's interesting, we talk a lot about sort of the gap between the rich and the poor, and oh my God, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk own everything, yada-da. Now let's look at the data. This is the OECD data set, and you look at the top 10% of income earners in Japan and the US, and you actually find that Japan is the only country in the OECD where the bottom 10% is moving up faster than the average. And look, any of us who's ever led a team of people, who's run a company, the top 10% you don't have to worry about. They're go-getters anyways. A true great leader is somebody who actually brings up the bottom 10%. And that is something that certainly since the late Prime Minister Abe is something that's happening in Japan. Now, the reason for why it's happening is because of my wife, Kathy Matsui. She did actually, many years ago, before she was born, Womenomics. Japan is a very male-dominated society, but there is no question that over the last 15 years, the conversation has changed, and female empowerment is actually something that is starting to happen. And you can actually show statistically about 62% of the improvement in the bottom 10% is because of rising female participation rates in the economy. There's a long way to go. You find, for example, 72% of the people working at minimum wage in Japan, 72% is females. It should be 50-50. So there's a long way to go, there's no question about it, but the conversation has changed. And again, the key takeaway here is that yes, let's talk about the gap between the rich and the poor, but let's figure out a way to actually empower and elevate the economic opportunities for the bottom 10%. And there, Japan certainly is doing a very good thing. Distribution of wealth, yes, Japan has very rich people, right? Did you know that? That on a per capita basis, there are more Aston Martins and Rolls Royces and Bentleys in Minato-ku in Tokyo than anywhere else in the world. It's an incredibly, if you ever go to Tokyo, do yourself a favor, go to the parking garage of the Hotel Okura or any of these rich developments that have come up there. There's an amazing set there. You know, interestingly, of course, in this data set here, you find that free market America and communist China, basically the top 1% control about the same thing, which is kind of interesting, right, that you've got this here. Leading by example. We talk a lot about government. We talk a lot about government structure, too much bureaucracy. Well, by now, everybody's had their financial crisis. And actually, the only country that has changed its regulatory framework, has changed its government bureaucracy by streamlining it, is actually Japan. The major bureaucracies fell from 22 to 13. And if you do work in finance, Japan is the only country where the response to the financial crisis was a complete change in the regulatory framework. They have created a unified regulator in the FSA, the Financial Services Agency, ripping out the different regulators from the Ministry of Finance, from METI, from the Bank of Japan, consolidating it into one regulator. And when I was at JP Morgan, we always used to joke with Jamie Dimon, the head of JP Morgan, it's like there's no regulatory arbitrage in Japan. While here and in the United States, you tightened capital rules, but the institutional framework, the regulatory framework, the supervisory framework actually has not been touched. So that's quite interesting, you know, that you do actually have this sort of coming through here. Good inflation. There was always this thing, oh my God, Japan is in this deflationary pit and it's terrible. Well, no. I mean, you know, where would you rather live? Right? I mean, in Japan, there is such a thing as a social good. And it was interesting, this is medical prices, where the government ruthlessly regulates, right? But you've got it in other areas as well. There's this wonderful anecdote of Prime Minister Abe, right, calling into his office the CEOs of the 5 telecommunications giants in Japan. And he had a chart of a 5 giga mobile phone contract in London, in Taipei, in Shanghai, in New York, and then in Tokyo. And Tokyo is 40% higher than the average of the other major cities. And Abe didn't say anything. He just pointed to the chart and said, this is a national embarrassment. Fix it. It's very interesting. And since then, prices have actually been falling, which is quite interesting. I don't want to be too romantic about the whole thing, right? But the government in Japan, the politicians, the ruling elite, as it were, is not afraid to redistribute profits out of corporations into the purchasing power of the real people, which is very, very interesting, right, that you actually see this. Affordability of homes. If you go through economic history, and many of you remember, Japan had this wonderful bubble economy. In my understanding, the Bank of Japan is the only major central bank that has ever broken a bubble economy. You remember on December 19th, 1989, the Bank of Japan appointed a new head, Governor Mieno, very small man, right? His first speech at the Imperial Hotel says, thank you very much for appointing me to this important position. Second sentence, bad things are happening in our country. The graduates of the best university, working for the best company in Japan, can no longer dream of ever being able to afford living in an apartment within a 2-hour commute. This is bad for society, this is a bubble, and I will burst it. And as you know, they record increased interest rates, and of course the asset bubble, collapsed. But it was a very conscious decision because of trying to rectify something that made the dream for the next generation of home ownership basically impossible. It's quite interesting that you see that. Now recently you've seen over the last decade, prices have started to move up again. But interestingly, affordability, because interest rates are so low, affordability is still very, very high. And you can do the calculation yourself. God forbid, if you work at a Starbucks and you earn a Starbucks salary, Tokyo is the only place in the world where you can actually afford to live in an apartment within a 45-minute commute. I don't think you can do that in Edinburgh, right? You certainly cannot do that in Shanghai. Berlin, impossible, right? It's quite interesting that you've got that. Again, I don't want to be romantic. I just want to like point out, some of the realities that actually have been going on. And you get the overall point. The point is, when you look at a national economy, yes, my day job, the question is the yen going up? Is it going down? Is the stock market going up, going down? That's a different discussion. I want to look at the overall outcome. What kind of society do you end up with the system of capitalism that Japan actually has? And you're optimizing for multiple outcomes. You're optimizing for freedom, freedom from government intervention, unfair competition, equity, efficiency, security, growth. Japan is not very good at optimizing at any one of these issues. But the holistic approach, optimizing for multiple outcomes, my view is that you should look at Japan as a model of capitalism that actually works. Now, back to the day job. Amazing, right? My friends were actually wrong when I turned the Japanese optimist, because it's not about turning the charts upside down. The charts are just flat. I mean, look at that. One generation, no income growth. Right? It's quite incredible that actually, happened here. Also find, of course, the big demographics issue. Jesper, you're crazy. How dare you be bullish on a country where in 172 years, only 6 people are going to be left? The demographics is very, very real, right? And you got to live with it. There is a reality of the demographics. I will never advise you to become a car salesperson unless you're selling Aston Martins, right? But the volume of things is obviously changing. And you got to adapt to the reality of this. 8 years ago, big headline, Japan on the front page of the New York Times. Oh my God, first country in the history of the world, more adult diapers sold than baby diapers. It's a terrible thing. So my friend and I, we went to visit Unichan, which is the biggest diaper manufacturer, and said, la, 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 how are things going? And how about those adult diapers? Oh, we love it. You love it? Yeah, because the profit margin on an adult diaper is about 3 times higher than on a baby diaper. Because, with a baby diaper, you do not give a shit, technical term, right? But with an adult diaper, I deserve the premium model. So you live with it, right? There's a reality that you adapt to. There are other things my Asian friends always complain. It's like, Japan is terrible. You come to Japan, you arrive at Haneda, you arrive at Haneda, and, the escalators, so slow. In Shanghai, so fast. Taipei, so fast. Hong Kong, super fast. Well, actually, 9 years ago, there was a Gyomumere, there was a public ordinance where the speed of all public escalators and electric walkways had to be cut by 15%, which is correct policy. Because if 1 in 4 of your population is now over 70, those things become dangerous machines, and yes, you got to slow them down. Now, of course, in Europe and America, we don't have that problem because none of the escalators actually work. But you get the point. Yes, aging is a reality. I'm not going to be bullish on Japan and tell you that Japan is going to be a 3% growth economy. It won't. Right? It's a slow growth economy. It's a mature economy. It's an aging economy. All of these things are very true, but there's enormous opportunity, that actually comes from that. So, let's have a look at a little bit of my day job. How many of you work in finance? Good. You don't have to be shy about it. It's perfectly fine. You're not going to say what you do. No, but it's interesting, right? But finance is nasty, right? These are the masters of the universe. Whether it's a hedge fund or whether it's a global sovereign wealth fund, we can invest anywhere, right? What do you got? What's new? What's different this time, right? So in my day job now, what's different this time? This is different. The most important thing, the most important asset for any economy, unless you're Saudi Arabia, right, is your people. particularly for Japan. I've got no natural resources. My brains, my people are all I have. So what is happening to the people? When you look at the elite of Japan, so the young men and women who graduate from Tokyo University, still going to the Ministry of Finance, going to the Ministry of the Economy is still a very, very prestigious job. So they go there. So you look at the data, how many of these young men and women who join the ministry when they're in their early 20s, how many of them quit while they're in their 20s or while they're in their 30s? And you see it was a flat line. Nobody quit. Why would you quit the moth, right? But as you can see, over the last 6-7 years, this has started to improve. There's a huge amount of liquidity that actually is starting to happen now. And what's interesting then, I got drinking with my friend who's the head of HR at the Ministry of Finance. And I said, well, where do these young men and women go? Do they go to JP Morgan? Do they go to Mitsubishi? Nope. 3/4 of them go to startups. So what does that tell you? When I was at JP Morgan, for me to hire an analyst from Nomura would literally take me 2 years of meeting with the family, meeting with the third cousin, convincing them that JP Morgan was a fine company. Now, these young men and women are actually changing. So the liquidity, the mobility is actually picking up. Young people are taking risks, which is very, very interesting. And that's the biggest change that you actually have in Japan, a younger generation that is empowered. My friend, who's the head of HR at Mitsubishi Corporation, every time he does a job interview in front of Keio University or in front of Tokyo University, he comes back crying. He says, oh yes, but my job's terrible. It used to be so easy because until 5 years ago, the young men and women were begging me to hire them. Now they look me in the eye and said, so what's Mitsubishi going to do for me? They've recognized that the demographics is in their favor, right? The fact that the number of university and graduate students is dropping every year empowers the young generation. And as you know, I do want to be reborn as a 23-year-old Japanese because I've got the power, not Mitsubishi, which is quite interesting. This generational change you see across the board. You actually look at listed companies here, massive generational change that actually is happening here. And you do see that with all of this going on, what I call the corporate metabolism, which is our corporations taking actions. Do we get M&A activity? Records amounts going on. We've got management buyouts, records amounts going on, record amount of startups, record amount of domestic business investment expenditure in Japan for the first time in one generation. So the metabolism is actually picking up. And one of the big reasons is the reality that, yes, we're dying out of people. As a result of that, we're going to have to actually sweat our assets harder. And this gets me to the single most important thing from an investment perspective. Japan is very proud. Remember, I am the system that coming from zero became the second largest economy in 21 years. In 1987 and 88, my stock market capitalization was larger than that of Wall Street. I was the success story of the 80s, of the 70s, and ultimately of the 60s as well. Germany as well. We leave that aside. When Franz Beckenbauer was around. But in all seriousness, you have a very, very proud system of managing your internal resources. And seniority-based pay was a big thing. Now, you've got leading companies. You've got NTT, the big telecommunications giant. They have a new CEO, and since April last year, they are introducing meritocracy, pay for performance, rather than seniority-based pay, which is very, very interesting, that you've got this change actually coming through. And as a result of that, a lot of things are starting to change. Number one, it helps female empowerment. Because if I'm just on a seniority-based pay, well, obviously, if you have a baby and you step out, for a year or a year and a half, the company doesn't know where to slot you back in, right? It increases mobility, and also it allows non-Japanese to actually have a fair shot, right, at actually succeeding in Japanese corporations, not by gaman suru, by waiting around and toughing it out, but by actual meritocracy. So if you are an investor, I urge you, meet with the CEO, meet with the CFO, but insist on meeting with the head of HR. Because if indeed NTT can show you of our 89 divisions, we now have got 28 where the head of the division is younger than the average people in the division, now you know that something fundamentally has actually changed. And of course, you've got ultimately, a focus on entrepreneurship. That it's not just NTT, but it's also startups can contribute to economic growth. And you can do the maths yourself. If you increase the share of entrepreneurs in your society by 1 percentage point, your potential economic growth rate actually goes up by about 0.6%. This used to be Israel, United States obviously doing very well, Japan, technical term, chuto hampa, neither here nor there, and Germany a little better than France. So what do I want to leave you with? I understand that we want to talk about the salaryman, right? That's nice and comforting because the salaryman never ruffles any feathers. Recast your image of Japan. This thing is ambitious, it's a bastion of stability, and it is actually very confident. And on the confidence side of things, let us please look at the data of corporate performance. Salaryman CEO, right? Japan doesn't have any superstar CEOs. There's no Elon Musk in Japan, right? People barely know the name of the guy who runs Toyota. But look at what actually happens here. This is listed companies. This is topics, and this is the S&P 500. You actually find that for the last generation, for 30 years, sales are flat. But profits are up 11 times. Anybody who's ever run a company, who's ever invested in a company, I mean, you can eke out a profit with a couple of quarters down. Doing this for one generation, I'm sorry. Salaryman CEO deserves the Nobel Prize for Applied Economics. It's just data. I'm not making this up, right? America, fine. You do see sales rising, you see profits rising, nothing bad, right? The one thing where Japan is bad, you see that the earnings volatility is very high, right? Which is obviously also reflected in asset markets. And as we just found out a couple of weeks ago, right, the Japanese stock market is basically 2.5x of the volatility of the rest of the world. But the overall achievement is actually being phenomenal. It's not just my data, right? There is a thing in Boston called GMO. It's an old established value shop. If you look at the actual, capital growth, the economic capital growth over the last decades, Japan is way better than Europe or the United States of America, which is quite interesting. Again, just focusing on the facts here. So it's the story of my life. I showed up in Japan around 1986, and you see that, earnings kept on growing, but the price earnings multiple that the stock market got, actually kept on declining, right? Sorry, I don't mean to sound like a stockbroker, but it was kind of tough, to sort of live through this. And then look at this. This is compensation. I mean, here's my little superstar CEO. On average now, you get almost 400 times of what the average employee of an S&P 500 company gets, right? The Japanese have improved, right? But it's certainly not the sort of big ticket money. I'll leave that for you on whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing. Superstars. Return on capital, right? Oh, we're in it for the money, right? Okay. The return on equity in Japan is now between 8.5% and 9%. Fine. The return on equity in the United States through cycle is around 16%, right? Double. But let's look at the distribution. And you see that, from the low to the high, Japan is this boring bell curve distribution, right? Clustered around the 8.5%, 9%. You see that America is actually much worse, with the exception that America has Michael Jordan, right? They do have superstars. About 13% of American companies have an ROE that is higher than 30%. Nice, it's just a fact, right? Question. Why? why does Japan not have any superstars? And very soon the sake comes out, and I get wonderful stories about, oh, we Japanese, we're not greedy. Right? Americans are greedy. It's all this wonderful stuff, which may or may not be true. I don't know. Even I'm ultimately agnostic. But there is an economic reality. It's the industrial structure. Japan is a hyper-competitive industrial structure. If you look at industries, and there's clusters of industries, basically METI does it in like 1,800 categories, the US does it in 1,700 categories, but if you look at from hairdresser all the way up to semiconductor companies, and you look at each of these industries, the top 4 firms, how much do they control of the revenues in that industry? And you see that in America, the top 4 firms basically control about 1/3. America is an oligopolistic industrial structure. Japan is not. The top 4 firms on average control only about 4%. Now, if you only control 4%, you've got no price power, right? Very, very different price power than operating in an oligopolistic competition, right? And so from that perspective, why are your returns, give or take, half of what they are in the United States of America? It's very simple, because I swim in a red ocean. There's constantly a shark trying to eat my lunch, which is very interesting, right? That you actually have this. Second myth. Okay, let's talk about redistribution, right? Let's talk about redistribution. This looks, since 1964, right, at companies. How do they distribute? This is sales, so that's your top line, right? And as you noticed, again, top line grows, right? Flat line here. During the bubble economy, workers got a little bit more, fine, but now it's basically kind of the same again, right? When you then look at shareholders, which is of course dividend plus share buybacks, you see that since Prime Minister Abe changed the corporate governance code and the capital stewardship code, right? You got a lot more activist investors, etc. You actually find that, wow, I'm actually well off. Do you know that the share buyback yield in Japan is now 150 basis points higher than it is in the United States of America, right? So shareholders are actually getting quite a big thing. Where Japan is special, retained earnings, right? I make money, right? I give to my shareholders, I give to my employees, but most importantly, I put it on the balance sheet, right? So Japan has unbelievably lazy balance sheets. And if you compare this around the world, right, for listed companies, you see that as a share of national income, just so you can cross-compare it around different countries, you see that Japan went from around 20% to 120% over the last decade. So I showed this chart to Prime Minister Abe, and he started frothing at the mouth. He said, let's tax them. Anyway, you get the point. But why is that? And by the way, a little self-advertisement to you. Why is Germany the only country where the cash balances don't increase? Because Germany is the only country in the world that has a different form of corporate governance. In Germany, by law, half of the board members are representative of the labor unions. So if you and I run a company and we make money, we don't think we need to raise the dividend, we don't want to do an M&A, we don't want to do a share buyback, whatever, the labor union says, hi, that goes to me. It's quite interesting in all this high-minded debate about corporate governance. Ultimately, the redistribution back to labor is something that in Germany is enshrined, but everywhere else it isn't. Now, because of Japan has these lazy balance sheets, right? Japan is a huge investment opportunity. Warren Buffett looks at this and says, wow, this is fantastic. Great operating efficiency and lazy balance sheets. There's things that we can do. Activist investors look at this and it's like shooting fish in a barrel. It's fantastic. Half the companies trade below book, right? So there's things that you can actually do, right? So it's phenomenal. The good news is that the real activists are actually the Japanese bus drivers. You remember this? 2018, the bus drivers in Japan went on strike. How did they go on strike? How do you strike as a bus driver in Japan? You keep on working. You just don't collect any money so that you hurt the capitalist, because the bus company, the owner of the bus company, still has to pay for the petrol and for the bus maintenance, right? And you buy enormous amount of goodwill with the people because they still get the service. And by the way, in Japan, the buses are always punctual, right? Anyway, so it's quite interesting, that actually happens here. Now, what's interesting in this distribution here, shareholders, lazy balance sheets, employees, the real thing that has dropped behind is business investment, right? You find that Japan is completely underinvested. One example is if you look at Panasonic. I mean, Elon Musk, Tesla, does not exist without Panasonic. Because 12 years ago, Panasonic was the only thing that could produce these batteries at scale. Here we are 12 years later, and Panasonic is one of them. It's no longer a serious player. So, well, dear CEO of Panasonic, what happened? Oh, there were no investment opportunities. There were no investment opportunities? Did you talk to the Chinese or the Koreans? There were tons of investment opportunities in the battery business, but you just preferred to have 1 trillion yen of retained earnings on your balance sheet. It's quite interesting, right, that you have that issue going on. And you see that obviously reflected in productivity. When you split this out, the tradable goods sector is doing reasonably well, right? But the service sector is, productivity has stagnated. And the reason it has stagnated is that they haven't invested, right? Now, interesting, because Japan is not Luddite. Japan is actually embracing technology in a very, very pragmatic fashion. This is a super survey, right, about the latest technology, which is, of course, artificial intelligence. And this is a global survey, right? And it basically asks people, products and services that use artificial intelligence, are you nervous or are you excited? And you've got the sort of European and Anglosphere here that says, oh my God, the robots are going to run our world, right? And then you've got the sort of global South that says, yeah, there's a bit of a risk here, but actually I'm very excited about the opportunity set coming through. And then you've got Japan, which is not really nervous, excited but not hyper excited, but just getting on with the business. And it's quite interesting, actually. 3 months ago, I had the opportunity to present to the board of Microsoft, and they tell me that the biggest, fastest take-up in AI-based solutions is from the Japanese local governments. Because the Japanese local governments are running out of people. They've got a lot of process-oriented work, right? You've got to get from A to B to C to D to get your residence card or whatever it is that you need to get. And if I can offer an AI-based solution, I will embrace it. It's quite interesting that you've got this sort of coming through. But then the real reason, of course, is this, right? Outside of my wife and daughter, my two favorite women in Japan, right? In my old office, the Shinmaru building, right opposite of Tokyo Station, right? Tokyo Station is right there, Shinmaru building. They've got this information booth, right? And these young ladies are always sitting there. They change their uniform with the seasons, so 4 different uniforms, very nice, right? And so I took this picture, and then I walked up to them and said, "Sumimasen, Tokyo eki wa doko desu ka?" Where is Tokyo Station? Right? And they say, "Oh, sumimasen." And they take out their iPad, they log into Google, they find Tokyo Station, and then they tell me, "Sumimasen, asoko desu." Sorry, it's easy to make fun, of this Japanese obsession with form over content, right? Of adhering to the form. And probably if they hadn't taken out their tablet, right, their supervisor would have yelled at them, right, for potentially giving me the wrong information. But, again, why is service sector productivity so low? Yes, there is an underinvestment issue. But there is also an issue, of ultimately, which is why we love England and why we love Scotland, of just using common sense, right, to actually get things done sometimes. Now, another example. Anybody remember this? Who remembers this? Nobody. This is the Tokyo Olympics 3 years ago. Okay, it was a whatever, right? We're all glad this is over, right? The COVID Olympics. This was the closing ceremony. And at the closing ceremony, for the first time on a global stage, they did the fireworks, not with explosives, but with drones, right? And they did this whole show. And then at the end, the drones go into this world sphere and everybody holds hands and sings Kumbaya and we're all one people, right? Very nice, very cool. Japan is cool. 3 weeks later, in Shanghai, there was a festival and they did the fireworks with the drones. And at the end of it, they turned it into this QR code. And if you took a picture of it, you got a free video game. You get the point that I'm trying to make. I mean, there's no question that Japan is cool, but Japan is not outward going, is not aggressive in selling itself. It's got the old craftsman attitude, right? You come to me because my products are superior. And that obviously is not the way the modern world works. Quickly, finally, a couple of mega trends in Japan. And I'm going to talk about only domestic mega trends. I'm not going to talk about global mega trends because AI, for example, everybody has to deal with it. It's just technological progress. What do you need to know about Japan? Number one, mark my word, this will be the only G7 economy where we will see the rise of a new middle class. And that's exactly because of the demographics. You now have the quality of contracts improving. For the first time in 20 years, full-time employment, not gig employment, not part-time employment, not contract employment. It is full-time employment that actually is increasing steadily. And you've got leading companies like Toyota, companies like Mizuho Bank, rehiring part-time or contract employees on a full-time basis. What happens? What's the difference between part and full-time employment? In Japan, there's three things. The first one is money, because if you're a full-time employee, you get access to the corporate bonus. And the corporate bonus is paid twice a year, in the summer and in the winter. And arithmetically, it's basically around 30% of your annual income. So if I get rehired as a full-time employee, my annual income goes up by about 30%. The second thing is leverage. Japanese banks are very nasty. If you're a part-time or contract employee, love or money doesn't buy you credit. The moment I become a full-time employee, I get access to credit. You saw that rise in land and real estate prices. It's driven not by rich Chinese buying Tokyo. It is driven by the next generation of Japanese actually having higher incomes, better contracts, and access to credit. And this is structural because of the demographics that you actually have. What's the third force? As a part-time or contract worker, you and I, Yuriko, you can get a date. You cannot get married. Statistically speaking, the moment you get a full-time job, your probability of getting married within 12 months goes up to 92%. I'm not a social conservative whatsoever. The Japanese are just very pragmatic, right? Just the nature of the game. So we shall see, right, whether that's going to have a positive impact, right, on the birth rate going forward here. So the main point is, yes, the population is going down, but the number of employees, the people who earn income, is actually going up. The quality of their contracts is improving. And as a result of that, you've got a lot of positive dynamics here. Second driver, again, demographics. This is Japan's corporate structure. There's about 3.6 million incorporated enterprises. Of those, 2.5 have owners who are now in their 70s. And 1.3, there's no successor. Daughter or son doesn't want to take over. So what happens when you're over 70? What happens? You've got a 1 in 4 chance of developing some form of Alzheimer or dementia over the next decade. And this is a big trigger. You're a family enterprise. I'm not going to sell to KKR on some valuation. This is my life. But now you're in your 70s and you realize, oh my God, my buddy Hayashi-san, who hung on too late, and now he's got dementia and he still doesn't know how to sort out the company. That's a problem. So now you're open to do a deal. So the reason for why we've got this wave of record domestic mergers and acquisition, a lot of that is actually driven in the belly of the economy, right? Is actually driven by the reality of demographics. And so this excessive competition, this red ocean, only 12% of the market being controlled by 4 players, lots of marginal players, right? This is going to sort itself out now, again, with demographics being a big catalyst. The third driver here is, yeah, I'm sorry, this is the richest baby boom generation on earth, right? Japan, over the last 38 years, has always been the world's largest creditor country. The savings pool is enormous. And what you get now, over the next 10 years, because of death, you've got the equivalent of about 1.3 times of GDP being transferred to the next generation. Sure, the Ministry of Finance will want to take its fair share. Inheritance taxes are very high. But still, you've got a significant amount of wealth transfer that actually is going on here. And you do actually see that the baby boom generation is incredibly rich going forward there. The fourth driver is that I'm way too cheap. I mean, Japanese wages haven't grown. Wages everywhere else in the world have grown. So as a result of that, where are we? If you're a software engineer, graduate from Keio University, you are 1/3 of the price of a software engineer in Silicon Valley. You are 30% cheaper than a software engineer in Hanoi, in Vietnam. So as a result of that, what you actually do find is that now there's many companies coming into Japan, actually hiring Japanese talent because it's cheap. Yes, you got to manage them, but all of a sudden the tables have turned. And as a result of that, again, you do actually see inward direct investment. And then the final point, immigration. Very controversial everywhere. There is no model that works, right? But look at the reality. I showed up in the mid-1980s. There were 500,000 non-Japanese living and working in the country. Today, 3.2 million. You actually find that over the last 18 months, you find that, yes, thank you, the population is dropping by 2,200 people every day. Every day, the Japanese population goes down by 2,200 people. But what nobody tells you is that over the last 18 months, every day, there's 1,200 people who get a work permit or permanent residency. And what's interesting is that the people dying, their average age is around 80. The people who get the work permit, their average age is 27. I leave it up to you to figure out. Anyway, you get the point. So it's quite interesting. I realize where Japan is coming from. But the point is that Japan is very pragmatic and that the response to the labor shortage, is actually happening, and Japan is actually becoming, my next article is going to be Japan as a global melting pot, right? And obviously these people come predominantly from Asia Pacific. Quick fact, 1 in 3 graduate students at the Japanese public universities is Chinese. It's a very, very dense relationship that you actually have. A couple of policy challenges. Well, look, zombies. This is cool. Like these people here, 12% of all corporates in Japan cannot cover their interest expense out of profits, which, given that interest rates have been 0 for the last 3 years, is actually difficult to do. So it's quite interesting, right? But you do have these zombie companies, right? And the question is now, will we start to get some genuine, and apologies, Mr. Adam Smith, but this is more Austrian, Schumpeterian type of creative destruction. It's one of my favorite charts. This is bankruptcies. And you see that in the 1960s, during the period of high growth, bankruptcies actually increased. During the bubble, they declined. The bubble collapses, bankruptcies shoot up. In the late 1990s, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party issues a moratorium that basically says nobody's allowed to go bankrupt. We will buy government support. We will hand out free credit. About 2/3 of Japan's corporate credit is guaranteed by the Japanese taxpayer or the Bank of Japan. And as a result of that, yes, bankruptcies collapse. Now recently they've started to increase, and it'll be interesting to see whether the next generation leadership in the LDP is actually going to allow for this sort of creative destruction to come through. And this is where this consensus comes in. This is the governor of the Bank of Japan, Professor Ueda. This is the outgoing Prime Minister Kishida. They've obviously had this consensus, to keep the bubble going for the time being, but it'll be interesting to see, whether that's going to go away. More complicated. Where does Japan make money? Listed companies, about 2/3 of their money is made outside, either by exports or by producing overseas. And the balance of power has changed. It used to be very lopsidedly dependent on the US, but now it's basically China and Asia excluding China. Why is this important? Well, because America has decided that for its own geostrategic regions, now China is the enemy. So this Cold War is a huge problem for Japanese corporate leaders, because I am linked at the hip to the People's Republic of China. I am linked at the hip, right, to companies that are very friendly to the People's Republic of China. And now I have to choose sides. But look, my customers, there's this wonderful survey done every year, right, out of Singapore. If ASEAN were forced to align itself with one of the strategic rivals, which one would it choose? Anyway, you get the point, right? And the reason this is a problem, you actually see this, that Japan's exports of goods are actually very weak. Specifically, what do the Americans do? The Americans say, well, what is it called? Small yard, high fences, right? So we're basically going to target, not everything in China is bad, but the high-tech stuff is bad. Well, who produces the stuff that makes the high-tech stuff? It's me. It's the Japanese Fanuc. It's Murata. It's Japanese high-tech companies that provide the robots, that provide the factory automation systems, right? That actually make this stuff work. And now they have to cancel their orders because the Americans tell them, you cannot supply this to this guy in Indonesia whose name happens to be Lee, because we think that he's a Chinese and he's going to do nasty things. I mean, sorry, this is controversial, but this is a huge problem that Japan actually has, right, in terms of going forward. The final point is this one. When I turned the Japan optimist about 20 years ago, my mentor, said, this is great, right? This was when Japan was falling into this deflationary pit. And my mentor said, yes, somebody needs to speak up, and you're a gaijin, that's good, right? So blah, 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 right? Well, you're a gaijin, you work for JP Morgan, that's good. so well, whatever, but then we drank some sake and it's all very nice, right? And then he says, but yes, you need to be careful. You need to reconsider if and when Japan decides to increase defense spending. Well, here we are. Japan has decided to double its defense spending. Why is this a problem or a potential risk? The reason is that Japan's innovation system is not geared to dual-use technology and the military-industrial complex. Let me give you a concrete example. This thing here, right, is arguably, the most important device that has been developed over our generation, and the mobile telephony basically has changed everything, right? How much of the value chain of, that goes with a smartphone, how much of that is Apple? It's about 3%. The internet has nothing to do with Apple. The internet also has nothing to do with a bunch of Stanford professors wanting to talk to their girlfriends at Berkeley. The internet has everything to do with the American military innovation complex, right? Actually allowing the scale and having zero problems with dual-use technology. And this is an innovation system that Japan is incapable of doing, at least at the moment. So Japan is doubling defense spending, nice, or whatever, but is that going to make Komatsu a better company? Is that going to empower dual-use technology at scale? Is a very, very big problem. I don't have an answer to that, but that's a big, big challenge that Japan actually has. And then I want to make a final point. I apologize to Mr. Smith, but I have to put a little balance in. This is a Frenchman. And look, I think this is the key issue. What gets people excited? Why do people get out of bed? Why do people do what they do, right? And what has happened in Japan over the last 4 or 5 years is that the Japanese elite, and whether it's the media, whether it's the business leaders, whether it's the politicians, be my guest, they've recognized that the two big partners, the United States of America and the People's Republic of China, both are not trustworthy. Both are unpredictable. And as a result of that, the real mobilization of animal spirits actually comes from self-preservation. Because Japan does not want to fall between the cracks, so to speak, between those two superpowers. So why are we seeing, unprecedented changes in the way human capital is being deployed, right? In the way the young generation is taking risk, in the way, the corporate elite is adjusting to corporate takeover requests, et cetera, it's exactly because, Japan is actually very focused on self-preservation now. The strengths of Japan, and I apologize, in the first session that we did, 2 or 3 days ago, somebody pointed out to me that I've been stuck in Japan for too long. Obviously, KKK is a bit controversial, but look, it's actually in Japan, KKK is a big thing, right? But I think if you look at the sort of the curiosity, right? The Japanese are very curious. They constantly study what's going on in the rest of the world, right? Kaizen, this focus on incremental improvement, right? The Japanese are very good. The reality that already the world's best egg sandwich, the one at 7-Eleven, that every year they manage to make it better is quite amazing. You think this is impossible, but nope, they got it better, And then, of course, the reality here, kenkyo, which is humility. The Japanese are very humble people, right? They don't brag about their achievements. They just get on with things. And so I would urge you to have a closer look at Japan. And if you get bored in all that study, right, you might as well try this, because Japan is actually the only G7 currency that actually floats on water. Thank you very, very much. If you care, I think we've got time for 1 or 2 questions or comments, or we can enjoy ourselves on the terrace. I will join you in a couple of minutes. But if there are any questions or comments, please let me know. No? Sure. Thank you.
The second one is that in Martin Wolf's book about
yeah.
He talks about some solutions.
Yeah.
And one of the solutions is
yeah.
Again, the trust dimension.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, one of the really interesting charts was this whole youth movement.
Yeah.
This whole people stop flying around different countries. Getting like that English is value.
Right.
And I just wonder if that youth, if they start moving away from
yeah.
Does that trust in, does that disappear?
So I think it's exactly the opposite. Because you talk to the youth, right? And Japan is the best country in the world. Where would you rather be? Right? Because you are being respected. Yes, you got to sweat, right? Yes, you got to respect your elders. Very important, the older I get, right? But the values in terms of what is the environment that actually is being created, right? Is your quality of life and your opportunity set actually adjusting, right? And that balance, right, between the stability, the safety, right, plus the opportunity set to actually fulfill or allow you to fulfill your ambition, that is actually what's happening. Another point I'm going to give you, right, is that, Japan, right, one of my favorite anecdotes is that when you go to Japanese elementary school sports day, right, and what you see the 50-meter dash, right? And there's these young boys and girls with their hand, and they do the thing, and the gun goes off, right? And they are competing with 6-year-old boys, right? Or 6-year-old girls. They're competitive. 5 meters before the finish line, whoever is in top slows down, holds out a hand, and they cross the finish line together. Dear Elon Musk, how about it? Any other comment, question? Kathy?
That was great, Jesper. Thank you so much. On the topic of trust, as a clinical psychologist, I'm fascinated by it. And actually, there are a lot of data to suggest that it's paradoxical, and actually very high. But there are some theories that, in fact, the trust is low in Japan, but the reliability is very high. And you know what you're going to get. And in the US, it's a total shit show. So you have to trust someone to know that I trust you, so it's all good. Right? And so, I don't know if it totally holds up, but it makes me wonder in the same question. About the youth, if there's change going on, and if the reliability is going down in Japan, what do you think that will do? Like, because so much of what's been successful back then, you know what you're going to get, right? And people know what the expectations are, and the law is so high. And so, if we're going to disrupt that, is that?
But what is very interesting is, right, that we automatically assume, as Anglo-Americans, sorry, as a German, if I'm allowed to say that, we automatically assume that therefore everybody's going to become more selfish.
I don't know.
And I do not. As a hypothesis, I don't think that that's exactly what's going to be happening. I think quite the opposite, right? I actually think that the sort of leadership within the group, right, and the willingness and the focus on actually bringing up the bottom 10%, rather than just having the top 1% run away, right? I think that that's going to be enforced. And I actually think, maybe naively, but I actually do think that the wave of immigrants coming in will actually encapsulate exactly that. I give you one other example, and then we go to the Tiras, right? Which is that, you talk about immigration, and that may seem a little odd, right? But it's just a reality. To get permanent residency in Japan, when I showed up in the mid-1980s, it took 10 years of living in Japan, right? Now it takes 3 years of living in Japan. After 3 years, if your son and daughter goes to a Japanese university, which is 4 years, after the 3rd year, he or she can apply to actually get permanent residency. But if in the 15 months before you apply to permanent residency, you got a parking ticket, you're back in the queue. I mean, the rules, they're Japanese. The rules are applied very, very rigorously. And it doesn't matter whether you're Elon Musk or whether you're from the wrong side of the train tracks. The rules are applied, whether you're Carlos Ghosn or whether you're some normal employee. It's quite interesting that you've got this. And that, I think, I think that the big argument about the decline, right, in civil society, and this is me talking, and we should be having a glass of strong whiskey, yeah? But the big reason for the decline in civil society in the United States of America is because the law is no longer applied equally, while the law in Japan is applied equally. This, that, or the other. We're still human nature, right? But still, for all intents and purposes, this is the pride that Japan has. No exceptions. Thank you.